Question of the week is the European Union using climate regulation as a silent instrument of trade diplomacy to pick the winners and losers among African ports? And to go even a bit deeper, we are going to aim to answer what are designated ports and why I think you should care. Welcome to Question and Analysis. My name is Edward Mithamo, and today we're going to have a conversation that I believe is largely ignored by the major news, and you cannot really blame them. It seems like the whole world is on fire, right? At least a part of it. The Suez Canal has been an issue for at least the last 2 years, and now everyone is talking about the Strait of Hormuz. We're talking about missiles being launched, we're talking about personal security, we're talking about the security of the vessels, we're talking about physical security as an aspect, and that you should care about completely. But there's something that's happening underneath all this, and I believe that it is only right that I do my very best to bring it to light and to try and dissect it in a way that you will understand. So while the missiles are flying and it seems like the world is about to come to an end, something is quietly brewing and happening in Brussels.
Shipping links our continents, sustains our industries, and helps feed our citizens. But in this process, we also emit greenhouse gases, and not only. Maritime transport accounts for nearly 3% of global emissions. This is why decarbonizing shipping cannot sit apart from our wider sustainable development agenda. It touches climate action, ocean health, food security, and the resilience of coastal communities.
This is something that is going to turn into legislation, and I believe that it will anchor and reshape how African ports are defined and how investment moves within African ports. And that's why you watching this as an avid person, you watching this as someone in government, you watching this as someone who is in a position of power, especially in the shipping and the maritime industry, should care. In 2024, the EU ETS moved from land issues and started touching maritime issues. So the initial conversation was that there are so many ships that are moving around the world, and while we are busy keeping factories accountable, while we are busy ensuring that the people that are on land are paying for their emissions, the ships are actually going scot-free and they're not really paying anything. So we saw the European Union come together and say that, you know what, we are going to find a way to tax the vessels. So if a vessel came, for example, from Shanghai all the way to a European port, we'd see that this vessel was actually going to be taxed for the carbon emissions that it actually released during the voyage. And this sounded quite okay. So they went down, they sat down, they wrote everything down into legislation, and it started being phased. The first phase was in 2024. But very, very slowly, they started realizing that the ships were actually finding a shortcut, so to say. So we started seeing that vessels found a loophole in the legislation by understanding what the definition of a voyage was. So the EU ETS legislation that was touching on maritime was actually accounting for the last piece of voyage. So let me give you an example on this. A vessel would come all the way from Shanghai and go into a port, like for example Portside in Egypt, and do transshipment there, and those containers would go from Portside into an EU port, and the only carbon credits or that they would actually pay was for that final voyage. Right, so they were saving millions on this, and this was a bit embarrassing for the EU, and they went back within a few months and they were like, okay, let's define what a voyage is. So they decided that they are going to come up with a criteria, and if a port met this criteria, this port is going to be given the term a designated port, which is a bittersweet situation if you ask me, and I'll do my best to explain why in this video. So the criteria was that they drew a circumference or a diameter along all EU ports and say that if a port is 300 nautical miles and below, in this diameter that you've drawn for 300 nautical miles, that port is going to be a designated port. But it had to meet two other criteria. So the second one was that 65% of the cargo that came to this port was transshipment cargo. And third was that this port was in a country whereby they did not have legislation that was touching carbon credits or carbon emissions. So when all ports that were in this circumference, so to say, were looked at, only two ports were considered to be designated ports. We're talking about Tangier Med and East Port Side. So those two ports became designated ports. What does that really mean? It means that if a vessel came all the way from Shanghai and touched Port Side and there was transshipment involved and those containers went to the EU, it would have been as if that vessel did not touch Port Said, meaning that the carbon emissions and carbon credits that this shipping line would have to pay would be as if it's the whole voyage. So this port would be rendered invisible when the calculations were being done, so to say. So this made these ports, left them in a very bittersweet situation because, and this is the bittersweet I was talking about earlier, these ports now started being avoided by the shipping lines that were looking to save on money, especially when it came to carbon credits. But on the other hand, we have two African ports that are in Africa, right? One in Egypt, one in Morocco. And these two African ports all of a sudden have been given a notch up and they are being considered in a conversation with EU ports. That is amazing. That is actually something, if you look at 5, 10 years, 15 years from now, that is something that is going to benefit those ports because of where they are structurally located and physically located. It means that these ports are actually all of a sudden written into the EU legislation. That means that investment started going into these ports, right? We have the big boys, DP World, AP Terminals, who are not really concerned about carbon credits, but they look at these ports and they say that these ports are not in EU but are being considered in the legislation, so we would rather rush there and invest. So these ports all of a sudden got a boost of income, a lot of money coming in. And that is a bittersweet situation because it depends on how you want to look at it. A shipping line might say, avoid that, let's use another port because we need to save money on carbon emissions and carbon credits. But investors might look at that and say, these ports are going to be in EU conversations for decades to come. So it makes sense for us to actually invest in them. Now, that was all in 2024. Now we are in 2026 and I'm sure you're asking yourself, why does this matter to you now? Well, it matters because they are back on the drawing board and they want to change a few things. So I've read the very, very long document and it seems like the two things that I feel are going to affect shipping lines are the fact that they want to increase the distance from 300 nautical miles to 500 nautical miles. Number two, they want to drop the percentage of transshipment from 65 to 50, meaning that the ports that are affected are going to move from around 2 to 7 or 8. And this means that now, especially the 50%, a lot of shipping lines and a lot of people are saying it's quite unfair because this will actually put active ports in that. And you know, when it comes to ports, right, they might see the bigger plan of if we become a designated port, it might actually matter to us longer. But these ports might actually be in dire need of cargo right now, and they do not need vessels coming and avoiding them when transshipment income has actually been holding these ports together. So something else to note is that there is another conversation going on because the shipping lines are saying that the EU team in Brussels are saying that even a port that has a draft of 11 meters and a berth of 50 meters should be put into consideration. But the shipping lines are saying that the vessels that are carrying these containers are about 5,000 GT plus. So if a port is 250 meters in berth and a draft of 11 meters, it is not deep enough to accommodate this. So you might be putting a small port as a designated port, while either way, a shipping line could not call that port because it cannot handle. It does not have enough draft to handle the big vessels. So the conversation on designated ports is ongoing. The legislation is being written now. And this is why I believe it matters to African ports. African ports have, for a very long time, spoken as individuals. So we have ports that are actually quite beneficial or benefit a lot from their positioning and physical aspects. But imagine this. I think about that 6 countries in Africa are not landlocked, meaning that they have access to the ocean, meaning that almost all of them have ports. What if African ports could actually have a conversation together as a block, right? Renegotiate as a block instead of renegotiating and coming on the table as individual ports? Because this Brussels conversation, while it is good on emissions, and we saw the early numbers and saw that because of this, emissions from ships actually went down by about 50%. But the truth of the matter still remains that a conversation is being had, not on African soil, right, with minimal to non-African representation, but it's going to affect African ports for a very, very long time to come. And that's why I believe this matters to you. So the FCFTA collective bargaining, right? We need to have this conversation as 54 countries, because even the countries that don't have access to the ocean, these are countries that actually have inland ports, so they should be part of the conversation. We are a continent of 1.4 billion people. Everyone is talking about how by 2050 we might be the most populated continent in the world. Everyone is saying Africa is the fastest growing, but still, when it comes to legislation and when it comes to the conversation, we are not getting enough representation. That is just the truth of the matter. And secondly, there is this conversation on green fuel, solar, hydrogen, and this is an opportunity for African ports, meaning that it seems like the EU ETS legislation is pushing vessels to actually reconsider using heavy fuels. And that means that there's a very big opportunity for ports that actually align, and for ports that have a conversation on let's invest on recharging or refueling stations that are green. And I feel like this is something that we should think about as African nations. We should maybe push investments to ensure that we are in conversation when it comes to green energy and refueling station, and this might actually get modern vessels to actually call our ports a bit more, giving us revenue and giving us this. As I conclude, you now understand what a designated port is. You now understand what the EU ETS previous and current legislation is, and what African ports actually are affected, and what I think and I believe we should be doing together. But as I conclude, the question still remains is this: do you know enough about your local port to actually push the person who is in a legislative position to actually do something about this? Are we re-educating people? Are we going to stop acting as individuals or in silos and actually come together as a collective bloc and understand that as African nations we actually have a bigger and a deeper voice when we come together? Those are the questions that are left in my mind as I conclude this episode. But this is an urge for you to stay informed. This is an urge for you to stay connected and to ask the deeper questions, because it is in asking that we learn more, and it is in learning more that we're able to have such conversations, and it is in having such conversations that our future as African states can actually be in our hands and not in boardrooms in Europe without us being represented. This has been Question and Analysis. Have a wonderful day.